We begin with breaking news and the new warning to Canada by the U.S. president. The opening of a nearly $6.5 billion bridge funded entirely by this country under threat tonight. Donald Trump declaring on social media this evening, "I will not allow this bridge to open until the United States is fully compensated." And also importantly, Canada treats the United States with the fairness and respect that we deserve. We will start negotiations immediately. The Gordie Howe International Bridge would be the third crossing between Windsor, Ontario and Detroit, Michigan. Currently, there's a tunnel and the Ambassador Bridge. Its American owners claim the new bridge infringes on their exclusive right to collect tolls and have been fighting that in court for years. Let's bring in CTV's chief political correspondent, Vassy Kapelos. Now, Vassy, so much to unpack here. Let's get to the issue of compensation first. What kind of compensation is Donald Trump looking for?
When this story first broke, a lot of people thought this was just another loud Trump rant online. But then suddenly the whole thing looked very different, because this wasn't only about a bridge anymore. It became a story about power, money, political favors, and one meeting that happened quietly behind closed doors just hours before Trump exploded online. And honestly, the timing here is what shocked people the most, because while the public was hearing all this talk about protecting America, investigators were discovering that one of the people with the most to gain from blocking this new bridge just happened to have deep political connections tied directly to Trump's inner circle. That's where the story completely changed.
Yeah, not a huge amount of clarity there, Omar, but 2 points that I think are worth making. First of all, I am told by a number of people in this government that though the backers of the Ambassador Bridge, the competing bridge, are supporters of Trump and his administration. The second point that's important to make is that the bridge is being paid for by Canada. Once it generates revenue through tolls, our costs will be recouped, but there's an agreement with Michigan to then start sharing revenue. So the idea of compensation, I'm not exactly sure how it extends beyond any of that.
Now, this seems to be quite an about face, especially considering that Trump was a proponent of this project during his first term as president. He's got a long list of grievances in tonight's post. How much of this is about the bridge, and how much is it about trying to extract concessions on other issues, especially in the run-up to the Kuzma review?
And this is where things get really uncomfortable for Trump, because the Ambassador Bridge isn't just some random bridge crossing. It's one of the busiest trade routes in North America. Massive amounts of goods move through that crossing every single day. Billions of dollars depend on it. For years, one private family controlled that operation and made enormous profits from it. But the new Gordie Howe Bridge changes everything. It creates competition. It gives Canada and Michigan another modern crossing. It reduces dependence on one private monopoly, and naturally, that means somebody stands to lose a lot of money once this thing opens. Now here's where the controversy explodes. Reports started surfacing that a member of the Moran family, owners connected to the Ambassador Bridge business interests, reportedly met with Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick shortly before Trump publicly threatened the competing bridge project. Not weeks before, not days before, hours before. And once that timeline became public, people immediately started asking the same question. Was this really about trade policy, or was this about protecting wealthy allies? Because if a politically connected donor talks to top officials and then suddenly the president steps in publicly to attack a project that threatens that donor's profits, people are obviously going to raise eyebrows. And Mark Carney knew exactly what he was doing when this started unfolding.
I'm really glad you raised that, because if you look at the text, as you point out, we've got Ontario banning alcohol or taking U.S. alcohol off the LCBO, dairy grievances around China. And then at the very bottom, what I'm being told by people in the federal government is the most important part of all of this. He says negotiations are going to restart. Remember, he killed negotiations with Canada on a sectoral basis, on any basis at the end of October. So the very fact that he is saying explicitly that this is about restarting negotiations, even though it comes after all those grievances, leads me to believe this is about a whole lot more than just the bridge, Omar.
All right, Vassy, appreciate the insight as always. Thank you.
See, most politicians would have immediately started throwing punches back. They would have gone on television, accused Trump directly, turned the entire thing into a giant screaming match. But Carney didn't do that, and that's what made this so devastating politically. Instead of overreacting, Carney stayed calm. He stayed measured. He let reporters keep digging. He let lawmakers inside the United States start asking questions themselves. And the more people investigated, the worse the optics became for Trump, because suddenly even some Republicans looked uncomfortable. That's the part a lot of viewers missed. There were lawmakers in Michigan openly confused about why Trump was attacking a project that would actually help jobs and trade in their own region. Some conservatives started quietly distancing themselves from the rhetoric. Others publicly asked Canadians not to take Trump's threats too seriously. And online, the mockery exploded. People started joking that Trump went from America first to donor first. Late-night hosts picked it up. Political commentators picked it up. Social media turned the whole thing into a symbol of favoritism and insider influence. And honestly, that's dangerous territory for Trump politically, because his entire brand was built around fighting elites and exposing corruption. So when a story suddenly makes it look like powerful insiders are getting special treatment, that cuts directly against the image he spent years building. The pressure kept growing because the timeline just looked bad no matter how you explained it. A wealthy political ally reportedly speaks with administration officials. Hours later, Trump attacks the exact project hurting that ally's business interests. Congress starts demanding records. People begin talking about influence and favoritism. That's not the kind of headline any White House wants. And then Carney added another layer to this without even saying very much. Instead of turning emotional, he kept framing the issue around sovereignty, trade stability, and public infrastructure. That made Trump's reactions look even more chaotic by comparison. The calmer Carney looked, the angrier Trump appeared. And viewers noticed it immediately. Because while Carney sounded like someone focused on policy and long-term economics, Trump's posts sounded personal, aggressive, and at times completely all over the place. That contrast became one of the biggest stories, especially after Trump started reviving all the old rhetoric again about Canada supposedly taking advantage of the United States. But here's the thing. The facts made that argument harder to sell. Canada is one of America's biggest trading partners. Supply chains between the two countries support millions of jobs. Entire industries depend on cooperation across the border. So when Trump framed Canada almost like an enemy, even some Americans started questioning whether this was really about economics at all. And that's where the corruption angle became impossible to ignore, because people started connecting dots beyond just the bridge itself. Critics argued that this fit a much larger pattern: create a crisis, attack an ally, apply pressure publicly, and somewhere in the middle, politically connected interests benefit. Whether you agree with that interpretation or not, the perception alone became politically damaging. And perception matters in politics almost as much as facts, especially when memes and viral clips start shaping the conversation faster than official statements do. At one point, social media users were literally posting side-by-side timelines showing the donor meeting and Trump's threat within the same day. The visuals spread everywhere. And once something becomes easy for the public to understand in one image, it becomes very hard to control the narrative after that. Meanwhile, Carney kept doing something that frustrated Trump even more. He refused to give him the big public fight he wanted. That restraint may have been the smartest political move of the entire situation. Because if Carney had exploded emotionally, Trump could have shifted the conversation into nationalism and turned it into Canada versus America. But by staying disciplined, Carney allowed the focus to remain exactly where Trump didn't want it: on the allegations, on the timing, on the donor connections, on the investigation. That's why this story kept snowballing, and experts began warning about something even more serious. Some pointed out that if the administration really wanted to interfere with the bridge opening, they could potentially slow things operationally through staffing and border procedures. That's where legal analysts started paying close attention. Because now the conversation wasn't just about rhetoric online anymore. It became a debate over whether federal authority could be used in ways that unfairly benefited private interests. And if investigators actually uncover communications showing coordinated pressure behind the scenes, this could become far bigger politically than anyone expected in the beginning. That possibility alone already has Washington nervous. And honestly, the most damaging part for Trump might not even be the investigation itself. It's the image this story creates. A billionaire-connected business interest, private lobbying, political access, public threats. That combination is exactly the kind of thing voters across the political spectrum tend to hate, especially independent voters. And that's why this entire situation spiraled so fast online. Because once ordinary people started seeing this less as trade negotiations and more as powerful people protecting each other, the tone of the conversation changed completely. Even people who normally support Trump began debating whether this whole bridge fight made sense. Meanwhile, Canada kept positioning itself as the calm adult in the room. Carney and Melanie Joly focused heavily on diplomacy, stability, and rules-based agreements. They kept reminding people that the Gordie Howe Bridge was a joint infrastructure project tied to existing agreements with Michigan. That messaging mattered because it shifted attention away from emotional politics and back toward practical economic questions. Who benefits from this bridge? Who loses? Why threaten it now? Why after those meetings? And the more those questions got repeated publicly, the harder the White House found it to move the story somewhere else. At one point, Trump even tried changing the conversation entirely with more posts attacking Canadian leadership and trade practices. But by then, the narrative had already shifted. People were no longer only talking about tariffs. They were talking about possible favoritism. And once corruption accusations enter the public conversation, they tend to stick around for a very long time. That's why many analysts believe this situation became a turning point, not because of the bridge itself, but because it exposed how vulnerable Trump becomes when the focus moves away from tough political branding and toward questions about who actually benefits behind closed doors. And Mark Carney understood that perfectly. He didn't need dramatic speeches. He didn't need viral insults. He simply allowed the pressure to build naturally while American institutions, lawmakers, reporters, and commentators did the work themselves. That's what made Trump so frustrated, because every angry response only kept the story alive longer. Every aggressive post created another news cycle. Every denial pushed more attention back toward the donor connections and investigation. And suddenly the administration found itself trapped inside a controversy that was supposed to be about strength, but started looking instead like political favoritism exposed in public view. At the end of the day, this entire scandal became bigger than one bridge. It became a debate about influence, power, and whether political connections can shape government actions behind the scenes. And for Canada, the strategy now is pretty clear. Stay calm, stay focused, let the facts come out. Because the more attention this story receives, the more dangerous it becomes politically for Trump himself. And that may explain why his reactions have become increasingly emotional as this controversy keeps growing. Because sometimes the real problem isn't the accusation. It's when people start believing the accusation makes perfect sense.